Windows has dominated personal computing for over 3 decades. At its peak, it ran on more than 90% of the world's personal computers. For most people alive today, learning to use a computer meant learning to use Windows. But right now, in 2026, that dominance is cracking, and the alternative that is gaining serious ground was not built by a corporation, does not cost a single dollar, and gives back something Windows has been quietly taking away for years: control. For years, Windows was the default. You bought a computer, it came with Windows, and you used it. That arrangement worked because the alternatives were difficult, obscure, and incompatible with the software people needed. None of those conditions are true anymore. The open-source operating system ecosystem, particularly the Linux family of distributions, has reached a level of maturity, usability, and hardware compatibility that makes the comparison with Windows not just fair, but in many cases, decisive. This video is going to show you exactly what has changed, why it matters, and why millions of people are already making the switch. To understand why the alternative is gaining ground so rapidly, you first need to understand what Windows has become, because what it is today is meaningfully different from what it was when most people formed their opinion of it. Windows 11, released in 2021, introduced a set of hardware requirements that effectively declared hundreds of millions of working computers obsolete. The TPM 2.0 chip requirement alone stranded an estimated 240 million to 400 million machines, devices that functioned perfectly well but failed Microsoft's eligibility check. The official response from Microsoft was direct: buy new hardware or stay on Windows 10 until its support ended in October 2025. That end-of-life deadline has now passed. Hundreds of millions of users are running unsupported software or facing a hardware purchase they should not have to make. Beyond the hardware wall, Windows 11 made the Microsoft account mandatory for setup on most configurations. Your computer, which you purchased outright, now requires you to authenticate with a Microsoft server before you can use it. Once inside, telemetry is active by default, collecting data about your usage, your hardware, your application behavior, and transmitting it to Microsoft. This telemetry cannot be fully disabled, even in paid professional editions that users specifically purchase for greater control. OneDrive integrates itself persistently into the file system. Microsoft Edge reinstalls itself after removal. Default app settings reset following updates, undoing choices users made deliberately. Every one of these behaviors is a decision, not an accident, a structural shift toward an operating system that serves the platform's data and commercial interests alongside the user's actual work. Then there is the cost. A Windows 11 home license costs approximately $139. A Pro license runs $199. For individual consumers, that is a one-time expense. For businesses running hundreds or thousands of machines, it becomes a significant and recurring budget line. For users in developing countries, the cost differential between Windows and its free alternatives is not an inconvenience. It determines whether computing is accessible at all. GitHub Copilot, Microsoft Recall. The push toward Windows 365, a version of Windows that runs entirely on Microsoft's cloud, which you do not install and do not own, but rent. These developments point in a consistent direction. Windows is becoming infrastructure for Microsoft's AI and cloud business. Your data, your documents, your usage patterns are the input. The subscription is the output. Understanding that trajectory is what makes the open-source alternative not just appealing, but structurally important. The operating system that addresses every one of these problems comprehensively, at no cost, and with complete transparency about what it does, is Linux. Specifically, the modern Linux desktop distributions that have transformed over the past 5 years into genuinely polished, powerful, and user-friendly systems that require no technical background to install or operate. Linux is not a single product. It is a family of operating systems called distributions, or distros, built on the same foundational Linux kernel, first published by Linus Torvalds in August 1991. There are currently over 600 active distributions, ranging from beginner-friendly systems designed to feel immediately familiar to highly specialized environments built for security research, privacy, scientific computing, and system administration. For users making their first move away from Windows, distributions like Linux, Mint, Ubuntu, and Pop!_OS are the most commonly recommended starting points. Linux Mint, in particular, has been designed explicitly to provide a transition experience that feels natural to Windows users. A taskbar at the bottom of the screen, a familiar application menu, straightforward file management, and a software center that handles installation of thousands of applications without any command line interaction required. What does a modern Linux desktop give you that Windows does not? The list is concrete. Zero licensing cost. Every mainstream Linux distribution is free to download, install, and use on as many machines as you want, without activation keys, product registration, or subscription tiers. No mandatory telemetry. Linux distributions do not collect and transmit your usage data to a central server. What happens on your machine stays on your machine unless you explicitly choose otherwise. No forced updates. You control when your system updates, which updates to apply, and whether to apply them at all. The operating system does not override your choices or restart your machine without permission. No hardware lockout. Linux runs on hardware that Windows 11 has officially declared incompatible. The same machine that Microsoft's PC Health Check tool flags as ineligible will run a current Linux distribution without modification. Full software control. Every application on a Linux system can be removed cleanly and completely. Nothing reinstalls itself. No browser resets your defaults. No cloud storage service embeds itself into your file system without your knowledge. Open source architecture. The entire operating system, every line of code, is publicly readable. Independent security researchers, universities, corporations, and governments around the world audit it continuously. Security vulnerabilities, when found, are disclosed publicly and patched by a global community. There is no black box. The software ecosystem that once made Windows essential has moved. Google Chrome runs on Linux. Firefox runs on Linux. Spotify, Discord, Slack, Zoom, VS Code, VLC, LibreOffice, GIMP, the tools that cover the daily workflow of the overwhelming majority of computer users are all available natively on Linux. Steam, the world's largest PC gaming platform, has invested heavily in Linux compatibility through its Proton compatibility layer, which enables a growing library of Windows-native games to run on Linux without modification. Valve's Steam Deck, a handheld gaming device that has sold millions of units, runs Steam OS, a Linux-based operating system, demonstrating at consumer scale that Linux gaming is not a hobbyist project but a commercially viable platform. Here is what the direct comparison looks like in practice. Using the case of a user whose machine was stranded by Windows 11's hardware requirements. A laptop manufactured in 2016 with an Intel Core i5 processor, 8 GB of RAM, and a 256 GB SSD fails Microsoft's TPM 2.0 check. Microsoft's official options: purchase a new device or remain on unsupported Windows 10. The hardware is functional. The performance is adequate for documents, web browsing, video calls, and standard productivity work. The machine has not degraded. The eligibility rules changed around it. That same laptop, loaded with Linux Mint 22, boots in under 20 seconds. The desktop environment is immediately navigable for anyone familiar with Windows. The Software Center provides access to thousands of applications. The system runs faster on the same hardware than Windows 10 did. Because Linux has a significantly smaller base resource footprint, Linux Mint requires as little as 2 GB of RAM to operate, compared to Windows 11's baseline of 4 GB. The laptop that Microsoft declared obsolete performs better under Linux than it did under the operating system it was originally sold with. The Spiceworks Q1 2026 survey found that 52% of enterprises are currently deploying Linux desktops, up from 18% in Q1 2025. An additional 34% reported plans to deploy within 12 months. Survey respondents cited total cost of ownership savings, averaging 61% compared to Windows, and stability improvements reducing IT support burden by 68% on average. These are not figures from open-source advocacy groups. They are reported operational outcomes from enterprise IT departments making budget decisions. Linux Foundation research published in late 2025 documented that the open-source ecosystem powers over 90% of the world's cloud infrastructure. 100% of the top 500 supercomputers in the world run Linux. The International Space Station runs Linux. Air traffic control systems in major airports run Linux. The operating system that is often framed as an alternative for technically adventurous users is, in practice, the operating system that runs the world's most demanding and critical infrastructure. The summary of what open source offers in 2026 is not complicated. It is free. It respects user privacy by design. It runs on hardware Windows has abandoned. It provides full transparency about what it does and how it does it. It is supported by a global community of developers, corporations, universities, and governments. It has reached a level of usability where the transition from Windows requires no technical expertise, just the willingness to download an ISO file, write it to a USB drive, and follow an installer that takes less than 30 minutes. Windows remains a capable operating system. Microsoft makes genuinely useful products, and for many users the trade-off still makes sense. But the argument that Linux is too difficult, too limited, or too obscure to be a realistic alternative for mainstream users is no longer supported by the evidence. The forces driving users away from Windows, mandatory accounts, telemetry that cannot be disabled, hardware requirements that strand working machines, and a structural shift toward cloud-based subscription computing are not temporary friction. They are the direction. The open-source alternative is not a compromise. For a growing number of users, in a growing number of use cases, it is the better choice, and the data from enterprise deployments, from gaming platforms, from global infrastructure, and from the hundreds of millions of people who have already made the move, confirms it. The question is not whether Linux is ready. The question is whether you are.